Picture this. It is 10 a.m. Eastern Time on April 13th, 2026. Somewhere in the narrow, sun-scorched waters of the Strait of Hormuz, a massive American destroyer cuts through the Arabian Gulf like a steel wall. Its radar systems are spinning, its weapons are hot, and somewhere on the other side of that same choke point, hundreds of Iranian speedboats are waiting in the shadows of a jagged coastline, engines idling, rocket launchers welded to their decks. The world's most critical energy corridor, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, carrying roughly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply, has just become the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet. And right now, at this very moment, the United States of America owns the lock to that door. This is not a drill. This is not a threat. This is happening right now. If you want to understand how we got here, what it means for the next 72 hours, and why the decisions made in these narrow waters could reshape the global balance of power for the next century, stay with us. This is World Brief Daily, and this is the most important story in the world today. If you haven't subscribed to World Brief Daily yet, right now is the perfect time to do it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because situations like this evolve by the hour, and you are going to want to be the first to know what happens next. Let's start at the beginning of this particular crisis, because to understand April 13th, you first need to understand February 28th. It was on that date that the United States and Israel launched what President Trump himself described as major combat operations against Iran. Massive joint airstrikes tore into military and government sites across the country. In a single devastating blow, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed. The Islamic Republic, a regime that had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of asymmetric warfare and regional intimidation, was suddenly headless, reeling, and cornered. And a cornered Iran is an extremely dangerous one. Iran's response was immediate and calculated. Rather than launching a suicidal frontal assault against American and Israeli forces, Tehran weaponized its most valuable piece of real estate, the Strait of Hormuz. Since February 28th, as reported by the Wikipedia entry on the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has conducted at least 21 confirmed attacks on merchant vessels, warned all ships away from the strait, and reportedly scattered naval mines throughout those shallow waters. Major container shipping companies, Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, immediately suspended all transit operations. The flow of oil, which had represented roughly 25% of the world's seaborne crude trade passing through Hormuz, ground to a near-complete halt. Brent crude prices, which had been hovering around $70 per barrel before the war, began their relentless climb toward catastrophe. Here's what that looks like in real-world terms. According to CBS News, the disruption of shipments by more than 90%, roughly 10 million barrels per day, raised energy and agricultural input costs worldwide. As of Monday, April 14th, Brent crude was nearing $100 per barrel, having risen approximately 40% since the war began. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, speaking at the Semaphore World Economy Conference on April 13th, said bluntly that oil prices will likely climb until meaningful ship traffic gets through the blockaded strait, and acknowledged we could see prices high and maybe even rising in the days ahead. Those numbers are not just economic statistics. They are felt at the pump, in the grocery store, in every supply chain on Earth. There was a brief window of hope. On April 8th, a temporary ceasefire was agreed. Iran would reopen the strait. The world exhaled, but the exhale lasted barely 48 hours. Almost immediately, it became clear that Iran had no intention of simply handing over its most powerful leverage point. Instead, Tehran began a new tactic. It would allow ships to pass, but only for a price. According to reporting by CNBC and Time, Iran began charging tolls of over $1 million per vessel seeking passage. The Iranian parliament had passed legislation as recently as March 2026, establishing a formal toll booth system for Hormuz, with priority access granted to Chinese ships and fees collected in yuan, or untraceable cryptocurrency, entirely outside the reach of American banks. As reported by ABC News, Trump described this as world extortion and declared that no one who pays an illegal toll will have safe passage on the high seas. Still, diplomacy had one more chance to pull the world back from the edge. That chance came in Islamabad, Pakistan. Over the course of more than 21 grueling hours of face-to-face negotiations, a U.S. delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance sat across from Iranian officials in what analysts were calling the most consequential diplomatic encounter since the Cold War. The key sticking points were stark. According to ABC News, the United States demanded two non-negotiables: physical possession of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, what Vance called the nuclear dust, and a verifiable mechanism ensuring Iran could never again pursue nuclear weapons capability. Iran, for its part, demanded the right to continue uranium enrichment for civilian purposes, the release of $6 billion in frozen assets, guarantees around its nuclear program, the end of Israeli attacks on Hezbollah in Lebanon, and, critically, the right to retain control over the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Esmail Baqai acknowledged that issues such as Iran's demand that it continue to control the Strait of Hormuz added complexities to the talks. That is a diplomatic understatement of historic proportions. The talks collapsed. Vance boarded Air Force Two and left Islamabad. As he departed, he said, "We leave here with a very simple proposal, a method of understanding that is our final and best offer. We'll see if the Iranians accept it." They didn't. On Sunday, April 12th, President Trump took to Truth Social with an announcement that sent shockwaves across every trading floor, foreign ministry, and military command center on Earth. The United States Navy would begin blockading the Strait of Hormuz effective Monday, April 13th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Effective immediately, Trump wrote, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. He also instructed the Navy to seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran. The blockade, Trump declared, was all or none. No ship would pass until Iran relented. U.S. Central Command subsequently clarified the operational parameters. The blockade would be enforced specifically on vessels entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and the Arabian Sea east of the strait. Ships transiting to and from non-Iranian ports would not be impeded. The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations issued a formal maritime notice confirming these restrictions as the 10 a.m. deadline approached. But here is where the story gets genuinely alarming, because 2 days before Trump's announcement, on April 11th, a threshold had already been crossed that signaled the world had entered entirely new territory. Two U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Frankie Peterson Jr. and the USS Michael Murphy, pierced through the contested waters of Hormuz. These are not small ships. These are multi-billion-dollar, heavily armed warships representing the most sophisticated surface combat capability on Earth. Their passage was a message, and Tehran's response to that message was extraordinary in its aggression. A radio warning tore through the communications channels of the Arabian Gulf with a ferocity that silenced everyone who heard it. Iranian Navy operators at Sipa Navy Station broadcast a final warning to the American vessels. Final warning, final warning, final warning, divert to the Indian Ocean immediately. U.S. Navy Warship 121, you must alter course and go back to the Indian Ocean immediately. This was not posturing. This was the Iranian military looking an American destroyer in the eye and ordering it to turn around. Washington did not blink. This is where we are right now. And before we go any further, if this kind of deep, real-time analysis is valuable to you, take 3 seconds to subscribe to World Brief Daily and hit the notification bell. We do not do clickbait. We do not do speculation without evidence. We give you the full picture every time as events unfold. Now let's talk about what this military confrontation actually looks like on the ground, because the numbers are staggering. As of this moment, according to multiple sources, including Reuters and the Wall Street Journal, more than 50,000 U.S. military personnel are deployed at maximum combat alert across the Middle East. The Wall Street Journal has reported the U.S. is considering expanding that deployment to nearly 100,000 troops, citing what officials describe as insufficient support from European NATO partners. That NATO friction is real. Trump said directly on Fox News, "We're very disappointed with NATO. We're very, very disappointed they didn't come." However, the UK appears to be stepping up. A senior NATO military official told CBS News that The UK is leading planning efforts of a coalition comprised of more than 40 nations from around the world to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and protect freedom of navigation. France's President Emmanuel Macron announced preparations for a peaceful multinational mission to restore freedom of navigation and said he would convene a conference with Britain in the coming days to organize that effort, describing the mission as strictly defensive and separate from the warring parties. The American military buildup in the region is not a bluff. C-17 Globemaster transport aircraft, enormous cargo planes with cavernous holds, are flying around the clock into Middle Eastern bases. KC-135 Stratotanker aerial refueling aircraft, essentially flying gas stations, are positioning themselves to extend the range and endurance of every combat aircraft in the theater. Fully equipped elite infantry units are flooding into forward positions. And at the heart of this steel armada is the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, now establishing what amounts to a floating airbase in the Persian Gulf. Its stealthy F-35C fighters and multi-role F/A-18 Super Hornets weaving an aerial umbrella across the entire operational zone. The air component deployed to this theater is particularly significant. A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft, the legendary Warthogs, feared for decades by enemy infantry and armored formations, have seen their numbers in the region roughly double to approximately 30 airframes. These veterans of countless conflicts are flying at extremely low altitudes directly over the strait's surface. Why does that matter? Because the 30mm Gayu-8 Avenger cannon mounted on the nose of each A-10, a weapon capable of firing hundreds of rounds per second, is perhaps the single most effective weapon in the American arsenal for destroying Iran's fleet of fast attack speedboats before they can swarm a larger vessel. The A-10 is tailor-made for this exact scenario. At the strategic level, B-52 Stratofortresses and supersonic B-1 Lancer bombers that departed from RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom have made the intercontinental crossing to this theater. These aircraft, equipped with massive bunker-busting smart munitions, carry the capability to collapse underground launch facilities, the kind of reinforced, cave-carved, concrete-filled bunkers that Iran has spent decades constructing deep inside the mountains of its Hormuz coastline. The American military calculus at this moment is precise and brutally logical. Do not try to intercept the missile in flight. Destroy the launcher, the command center, and the radar before the order to fire is ever given. Now let's talk about what Washington is actually up against. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has spent years developing an asymmetric warfare doctrine specifically designed to neutralize American technological superiority in confined waters. The IRGC Navy operates an estimated fleet of over 800 fast attack craft, Boghammer, Zulfagar, and Ashura-class speedboats, some capable of reaching 50 knots, each one fitted with heavy machine guns and rocket launchers. The tactical concept is what military planners call swarming, overwhelming a target with sheer numbers of cheap, fast, expendable platforms until the target's defensive systems run dry. Iran is also reportedly planning to deploy more than 300 long-range kamikaze drones, including Shahed 136 variants and Mohajer types, to contest the skies above the strait. And beneath the surface, the threat is arguably even more insidious. Iran has reportedly seeded the waters of Hormuz with hundreds of moored and magnetic naval mines, dropped from small boats drifting with the currents, their exact positions impossible to pin down with certainty. The U.S. military has deployed AI-equipped autonomous underwater vehicles, described by some analysts as knife-fish-type systems, in an around-the-clock effort to locate and neutralize this mine network. Even so, the sheer density and unpredictability of the minefield is a source of profound operational concern. In a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, a single mine striking a billion-dollar destroyer would hand Tehran a propaganda victory it would exploit for years. Iran's land-based missile threat compounds the picture dramatically. Hundreds of mobile anti-ship missile launchers are currently concealed in the rugged, cave-riddled coastline that Iran controls along the northern shore of Hormuz. Missiles, including the Noor, Qadr, and the supersonic Khalij Fars anti-ship variants, can reach targets across the entire width of the strait many times over. And IRGC spokesperson Brigadier General Hossein Mohebi, according to CNN, warned on Monday that Iran could unveil new military capabilities and tactics and introduce new forms of warfare that opponents would have limited ability to counter. Iran's acting defense minister said the country's armed forces are already on, in his words, maximum combat alert. Before we go deeper into the military architecture of this confrontation, take a moment right now and subscribe to World Brief Daily. Ring that bell for notifications. Every time we publish an update on this crisis, and given the pace of events, that could be multiple times a day, you will be the first to know. Make no mistake, Iranian generals understand the asymmetry here at a deep level. They know that the moment they fire a single anti-ship missile, the full weight of American air power descends on their heads. That calculus restrains them, but it does not eliminate the risk. A single rogue drone, a single low-flying cruise missile threading its way through American electronic warfare defenses at wave-top height, a single mine detonating against a hull in the dark. Any one of those scenarios in these specific waters at this specific moment of maximum political tension could ignite a full-scale war whose consequences would dwarf everything that has happened so far. The U.S. blockade is currently strangling Iran's oil exports, which run at approximately 2 to 3 million barrels per day under normal conditions. That oil is the lifeblood of the Iranian economy, the single revenue stream keeping the regime functional during what is already a wartime economic crisis. Shutting it off is not a warning shot. It is a tourniquet applied directly to the regime's jugular. Massive oil tankers like the Mombasa B and Agios Fenurios 1, carrying millions of barrels of crude, have already been observed changing course on satellite imagery, diverting away from the Persian Gulf toward the safer waters of the Gulf of Oman. There is also the question of what this crisis is doing to global food security, which is rarely discussed in the breathless coverage of warships and missiles. The Strait carries not just oil, but fertilizer shipments, agricultural products, and manufactured goods. The UN negotiated a temporary humanitarian carve-out from Iran in late March to allow fertilizer shipments through during the spring planting season, a quiet acknowledgement that the blockade of Hormuz, if it persists, will eventually make itself felt in food prices on every continent. The interconnection of this single geographic choke point with the daily lives of billions of people who have never heard of the IRGC Navy is one of the most underreported dimensions of this entire crisis. Trump himself flagged the oil redirection directly on camera, saying that a lot of ships are turning around and coming to our country wanting to buy oil. Look at the American Gulf. We are filling them up with the sweetest, highest quality gas. Empty tankers on the high seas are now redirecting toward the ports of Texas and Louisiana. But let's pull back the camera, because there is a second player in this crisis whose stakes may ultimately exceed Iran's own. That player is China. Here is the number that changes everything. China, the world's largest industrial economy, consumes approximately 11.6 million barrels of crude oil per day to fuel its manufacturing machine. Of that total, nearly 20%, roughly 2.3 million barrels every single day, is purchased directly from Iran. Beijing has spent years constructing a financial architecture to conduct this trade outside the American dollar system, settling payments in yuan and in some cases in untraceable cryptocurrency, deliberately bypassing the Western banking infrastructure. In March 2026, Iran's parliament passed legislation that formalized this arrangement, creating a toll system in Hormuz that gave first priority to Chinese vessels and collected those tolls in yuan. This was not merely an economic arrangement, it was a geopolitical declaration, a direct challenge to the dollar-denominated global financial order that Washington has maintained since Bretton Woods. And here is the geographic reality that makes China's exposure existential rather than merely inconvenient. Approximately 50% of China's total crude oil imports, sourced from across the Middle East and beyond, must physically transit the Strait of Hormuz due to the geography of global shipping routes. The American Navy now controls that strait. Every single barrel of oil China needs to keep its factories running, its grid powered, and its economy functional has to pass through a choke point currently guarded by U.S. destroyers. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in a meeting in Beijing on Monday, said pointedly that Blocking the Strait of Hormuz is not in the common interest of the international community, and emphasized support for achieving a comprehensive and lasting ceasefire through political and diplomatic means. That is the language of a superpower that is watching its energy security architecture being dismantled in real time and does not yet know what to do about it. If China cannot access cheap Iranian oil, it faces an extraordinarily unpleasant alternative: redirecting its massive fleet of tankers to purchase oil from the United States or from American-aligned Gulf producers at significantly higher market prices, and necessarily through the dollar-based international financial system. That outcome would represent the effective collapse of the de-dollarization strategy that Beijing has spent years quietly building across Africa, Asia, and the developing world. The entire construct, purchasing Iranian oil in yuan, bypassing SWIFT, creating alternative financial rails, gets swept off the board by 127mm naval guns in a matter of days. And now we arrive at the scenario that has senior military strategists losing sleep. What happens when a massive Chinese oil tanker flying the flag of the People's Republic appears on the horizon and steams directly toward the American blockade line? This is not a hypothetical. It is an entirely plausible near-term development. The question it forces is one of the most fraught in the history of modern geopolitics. Does the U.S. Navy physically stop and board a vessel flying a Chinese flag in international waters? If so, Beijing can characterize that as a direct act of aggression against Chinese sovereignty, a potential legal and political trigger for military escalation beyond anything this crisis has yet produced. If the U.S. allows the Chinese vessel free passage, the blockade is immediately exposed as selective and politically negotiated, and every actor watching from Riyadh to Taipei draws their own conclusions about American resolve. Saudi Arabia, already being courted by Beijing as an alternative power center, would recalibrate its alignment calculus overnight. And in a scenario where Washington demonstrates that it will yield to Chinese pressure in Hormuz, Beijing's military planners accelerating their Taiwan timeline become considerably bolder in their calculations. Military analysts have been issuing warnings on exactly this dynamic for weeks. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer simply a Middle Eastern crisis. It has become the theater where the foundational question of the 21st century geopolitical order is being answered in real time. Who controls the world's critical infrastructure choke points, and who has the will and the firepower to enforce that control against all comers? China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is making diplomatic calls. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has stated that Moscow remains ready to help find solutions and described the American-Israeli operation as unprovoked aggression. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who served as the chief Iranian negotiator in Islamabad, posted a photograph on social media of gas prices near Washington, D.C., with the caption, "Enjoy the current pump figures." With the so-called blockade, soon you'll be nostalgic for $4 or $5 gas. He is not wrong that American consumers will feel this. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright confirmed on Monday that oil prices will peak only when meaningful ship traffic moves through the strait again, and he said he anticipates that happening sometime in the next few weeks. Sometime in the next few weeks at nearly $100 per barrel. And this is where all of the threads of this story converge into something that feels genuinely historic and genuinely terrifying. The Iranian regime is cornered. Its supreme leader is dead. Its economy is suffocating. Its oil exports have been severed. Its key asset, the Strait of Hormuz, has been seized from it and turned against it by the world's most powerful military. Yet a cornered regime with nothing left to lose is uniquely dangerous. IRGC spokesperson Mohabi's warning about new forms of warfare is not empty rhetoric. An adversary with 800 speedboats, 300 kamikaze drones, a coastline full of anti-ship missiles, and a minefield scattered across a 21-mile-wide waterway can inflict catastrophic damage even in defeat. Iran's swarm doctrine, overwhelming expensive American systems with hundreds of cheap, fast, expendable platforms, has the potential to exhaust a warship's defensive ammunition long before the threat is neutralized. And even a single successful hit, even one drone striking one destroyer, reshapes the political landscape in ways that are very difficult to predict. Meanwhile, 230 loaded oil tankers carrying millions of barrels of crude oil are still sitting inside the Gulf right now, according to the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company's CEO, Sultan Al Jaber, waiting, engines on, unable to move, trapped inside the world's most dangerous maritime parking lot. The U.S. blockade announced on April 13th is not the end of this story. It may not even be the middle. What it is, unambiguously, is a hinge point, a moment at which the United States made a choice to assert total dominance over the world's most critical energy choke point, accepting all of the risks and all of the consequences that flow from that decision. Washington has placed its bet, and Washington knows, as the transcript of events makes absolutely clear, that if it retreats today in Hormuz under pressure from Iran, it will face similar tests from China in the Pacific and from Russia on the plains of Eastern Europe. This is the logic that drives empires, and right now, the most powerful empire in human history is staring down the barrel of its own conviction. The next 72 hours will be decisive. Will Iran negotiate? Will China blink? Will a single drone, a single mine, a single miscommunication between a U.S. destroyer and an IRGC speedboat in a 21-mile channel tip this crisis from a naval standoff into something far more catastrophic? When a massive Chinese oil tanker appears at that horizon, and it may, and American destroyers swing their turrets toward it, the answer to who fires first will not just make the news that day, it will redraw the map of the world and reset the balance of power for the next 100 years. We will be watching, we will be analyzing, we will be here. If you want to make sure you never miss a single development in a situation this critical, subscribe to World Brief Daily right now and turn on your notifications. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand what is happening in these waters today, because the decisions being made here, right now, in these 21 miles, belong to all of us. This is World Brief Daily. Stay informed, stay ahead.